One of the Russian soldiers had his throat ripped out and he died, while another soldier had one of his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg severed, leaving just permanent injury. Hello. You saw the title, you saw the thumbnail, so you already know what this video is about. But if you are a returning subscriber, thank you. You're a real one. If you're new to the channel, please be sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell notification so you know when I post videos of true crime and strange stories that happen to be true. With that being said, let's get right into it. The Russian sleep experience. Ooh. In the 1940s, Russian researchers took 5 political prisoners and put them into a chamber and filled it with gas and a little bit of oxygen for about 15 days. While inside, they monitored their oxygen intake so that the gas that they were pushing into this sealed environment or container or room wouldn't kill them. Now during this time, this was way before cameras, but they did have microphones that they stuck inside the room, and they had 5-inch thick glass that they, or like portholes of kind of like on a ship, that you could look into the room and see what was going on. In this room, they had books, they had enough food to last all 5 men for actually over a month. They had cots, but the cots didn't have any bedding on them. And they also had a toilet and running water. Now the first 5 days were fine. The prisoners of this research experiment barely complained, and part of that was due to they were falsely promised that after the experiment that they would be released from captivity pretty much. Now after 5 days, they started to complain and started having severe paranoia. As time went on, they actually stopped talking to each other and started whispering in the microphones. Now when they were whispering in the microphones, they were whispering details about the other prisoners, and I guess they were hoping that if they did so, that it would gain them favor with the researchers on the outside looking in. After 9 days, one of the captives started running around the entire room just screaming at the top of his lungs. He did so for hours, and then suddenly it sort of slowed down and all they could hear was squeaks. The researchers later found out that he screamed so much that he physically tore his own vocal cords. Now when this happened, the other captives actually didn't do anything, but what they did do is kind of disturbing. They took their own feces and tore pages out of the book, smeared it on the pages of the book, and started placing it over the porthole window so that the researchers couldn't look in and they couldn't look out. And when they did that, that's when the other screaming captives stopped screaming, and so did the whispering in the microphones. After 3 days of complete silence, the researchers checked the microphones just to see if they were still working. They did this because they weren't hearing any sounds coming from inside the room, and they thought it would be impossible for 5 men to be in a room for days without making any sound. After they checked the microphones, they checked the oxygen consumption and figured that all 5 men were still alive. In fact, they figured that all 5 men used the oxygen consumption as if they were doing very strenuous exercise. On the 14th day, the researchers needed to get a reaction, so what they did is they used the intercom that was actually in the room, hoping to provoke some type of answer or some type of noise in general. They announced that they're opening the chamber doors to step away and to lie flat on the ground, and if you do not do this, then you will be shot, and if you comply, then one of you will gain your immediate freedom. But their response that they got was terrifying. One of the men whispered to the microphone, "We don't want to be freed anymore." A debate broke out between the military forces that were funding this experiment. Since they were unable to provoke a response, it was decided that on the 15th day, they would just open the door. Before doing so, the chamber was flushed out of all of the gas, and then fresh air was pumped inside. When they did this, they immediately got a response from 3 of the captives inside. They began begging and pleading, "Please, please, please, just turn this gas back on. Push this air out, but give us that gas again." The chamber door was finally open and soldiers were sent inside to retrieve the 5 captives. But when they went inside, the captives were just screaming because they didn't want to leave, and the soldiers were screaming too of what they saw. 4 of the 5 captives were still alive, and sadly, 1 was not. The food rations after day 5 hadn't been touched anymore, and the body parts of the dead victim was stuffed inside of the drain in the middle of the floor. Now, once they did this, it allowed the water to rise 4 inches inside of that room. All 4 of the remaining captives at this time also had large amounts of flesh and muscle torn off their bodies as well. And the scientists and the researchers couldn't determine of that 4 inches of water how much was water and how much was just blood. Due to the destruction of the flesh on the 4 surviving victims, researchers initially thought that they were fighting each other or biting each other, but that wasn't the case. As they looked closer, they found that these wounds were self-inflicted, so that these captives were biting themselves. The abdominal muscles below the ribcage had all been removed on the remaining survivors, but the heart, the lungs, and the diaphragm all were still in place. Researchers saw that these organs from the survivors that were taken out were just neatly placed on the ground just by the survivors. It was quickly determined that they stopped eating the food rations after day 5 and then just started eating themselves. Now, most of these soldiers were Russian Special Forces soldiers, but even they refused to go back into the chamber to try and retrieve these 4 victims. One of the Russian soldiers had his throat ripped out and he died, while another soldier had one of his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg severed, leaving just permanent injury. Another 5 soldiers would also pass away, but they would pass away due to suicide from this traumatic event. While trying to take out the captive, one of the 4 prisoners ruptured his spleen and he bled out immediately. When they tried to force him or take him to the hospital to sedate him, it just didn't work. It didn't work because while the doctors were trying to sedate him, they had to use 10 times the amount of morphine that they would normally use on a regular man. And while trying to sedate him, the prisoner ended up breaking one of the doctor's arms and one of his ribs. And even after his heart stopped from bleeding out, he continued to wail and just scream about for another 3 minutes. The remaining 3 captives were moved to another facility. 2 of them, who still had their vocal cords intact, were still begging to have more gas. One of the captives, who was severely wounded, was rushed to surgery immediately, but it was found that the sedatives that they were trying to use just didn't work on him. They were trying to place him under anesthesia. He fought so much that he was able to rip halfway through his leather restraints that were on his arm. It was only when they filled him with enough gas, more than a normal person again, that his eyelids started to flutter and then he slowly fell asleep. And then when that happened, shortly after, seconds after actually, he just died. The second survivor, who was actually the first person who started screaming and tore his vocal cords were still torn just severely, so he was unable to say yes or no or speak anything when they brought in the anesthesia to put him under in order to do surgery on him. He just shook his head yes or no violently if he objected or agreed to anything. The only time he actually shook his head yes was when a soldier just thought of the idea maybe we should do the surgery without the anesthesia. This is when he agreed. He was actually pretty excited about having a surgery without any type of anesthesia or being put to sleep. While doing the surgery, one of the doctors repeatedly said that it would be physically impossible for someone to still be alive while this surgery was going on. In fact, one of the nurses reported that she saw the prisoner smile every time he met eyes with her during the surgery. When the surgery was over, the captive looked at the doctor and began wheezing heavily as if he was trying to speak. Obviously he couldn't, so the doctor gave him a pen and paper and he simply wrote down, "Keep cutting." While doing the surgery on the other patients, the doctor said it was pretty much impossible because they kept laughing and they kept moving the table and shaking. So they used another drug to sort of just calm them down while still keeping them awake. But then he said that the drug that they used would leave their system incredibly fast. After some time goes on and the surgeries are done and their vocal cords are starting to heal, this is when they start begging and whispering as much as they possibly can at this time for the gas. And when the doctors asked them why do they want this gas so much, what is it about this gas, they said, "Must remain awake." The 3 remaining prisoners were put back into bondages and then put back into that cellar or that chamber. The gas wasn't pumped in yet, they were just restrained and put back in there. Most of the military heads said that the only thing left to do was to euthanize or to kill these 3 poor souls because there was nothing they could do with them. But a former KGB agent said we should put them back on the gas and see what happens. And sadly, this former agent got his way. The 3 captives were being monitored again, and their padding was, I guess, double padded so that they couldn't escape at all. And they only stopped struggling when they found out by accident that they were being put back on the gas. Being put back on the monitoring, they noticed that the brain would be normal for the most part, but at certain times the brain would just go brain dead and the heart would flatline. So they were suffering from small deaths before returning back to normal. As they were monitoring the brain death and the heart stopping, trying to figure out what this was or why this was happening, only one nurse figured out that as soon as the patient's eyes would sleep, they would fall into a sudden deep sleep, and that's when the brain would stop, and then that's when the heart would stop. That is when they would die, when they would go to sleep. Now, since there are only 2 survivors left, one of them who still had his vocal cords demanded to seal us in the room and turn back on the gas. So the commander gave the order to seal the room with the 2 survivors on the inside, as well as the 3 soldiers who took them in the room to prepare them to be sealed in for their long duration. After this, the remaining soldiers left the room. The soldier then turned his gun to the last remaining captive and said, "I will not be trapped in here with these things. What are you? I demand to know." Smiling, the subject said, "Have you forgotten so easily? We are you. We are the madness that lurks in you all. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to your nocturnal heaven where we cannot tread." The soldier aimed to the prisoner's heart and fired. The prisoner choked and gagged a little bit before saying, "So nearly free." And after a short time, the prisoner died. Some people say that this experiment is still going on in modern times. Researchers are still trying to perfect this gas. Alright guys, that is it for today. That is going to do it. Please like and subscribe and hit that bell notification so you know when I post true crime videos and strange stories that happen to be true. Thank you, and I will see you on another one.